clinical piece of things at Children's. Miracles for Mito and Summons for Samantha are a huge piece of that because the continued funding from those sources allows us to add in a lot of additional services that are not available at a lot of clinics around the country where patients with mitochondrial disease are cared for. So in particular, we have both a basic science research lab as well as a clinical diagnostics lab. And I think, Marisa, are you going to be speaking as well?
I guess, yeah, okay. I can talk a little bit about
this is your show, so whatever y'all want to do.
Yeah, I can address the connection between the clinical diagnostic lab and the research.
I think that you guys are doing some great work.
Sounds good. So I won't go into too much detail about that, but
you can talk as much as you want. Whatever. Yeah.
But I did mention the two research protocols that we try to have all of our mitochondrial patients enrolled in. So one of those is called the North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium, and the other is something that we call the Cellular Energetics Protocol. So I'll start with the Cellular Energetics Protocol. So that is that's a research protocol that gives us a pretty broad ability to collect information about our patients with mitochondrial disease above and beyond what's available with clinical testing. So the way that we're using that protocol right now is primarily to obtain skin samples, whether that's a small skin biopsy in the clinic or whether we can get a little sample of skin as part of a surgical procedure. And then we culture those cells, and Marisa maintains them in the lab. And then we have the ability to see how those cells are behaving with respect to their mitochondrial function. And the goal there is really to identify things that are reliable markers of mitochondrial disease in those cells, and then to be able to show that we can change outcomes for those cells, because changing the outcomes for the cells is dramatically quicker than monitoring the outcomes that patients have. So that's really a necessary first step toward any new therapies, is to be able to show that it works in what are called preclinical studies. So the initial preclinical studies are often studies that are done in cell culture. The next step might be studies that are done in animal models, which is also a part of the basic science lab that we have here. And then the last step is to move into clinical trials for those therapies that show promise, and to then be able to roll those out to patients in a really rigorous and scientific way that will allow us to figure out which therapies are effective and which ones are safe. And that's where the North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium comes in. So for any development of a drug or therapy, there are a number of necessary conditions that need to be in place first. So we have to have a really good understanding of what the course of a disease is without that therapy. So if we don't understand the natural history of a disease, then it's very hard to figure out if a therapy is effective or not. The other thing that you have to do is you have to be able to recruit large numbers of patients, which is very, very difficult for rare diseases. For folks that are starting a clinical trial and moving therapies into the clinical realm, a large part of the expense and the barrier that prevents more therapies from getting to that point is these mitochondrial diseases are very rare. We have not, a lot of them are only recently described, so we don't adequately understand the natural history of those conditions. And we don't have the ability to quickly recruit a large enough number of patients to show that something truly is effective. So the North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium is built to address all of those preconditions. So before we even know what the potential therapeutic intervention would be, so we just say, okay, starting now, we're going to define the natural history of all of the mitochondrial diseases. And that way, whether it's in 1 year or 2 years or 5 years from now, if a specific therapy comes along for a particular mitochondrial condition, at that point we can say, okay, we have 25 patients in the database who have that particular condition. Here are their ages, here are all the manifestations that they have, here has been the course of that condition for them. And so that natural history is kind of pre-packaged and it's ready to go if and when the need for it arises. The other thing that the North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium database does is that it's built-in recruitment for any of these therapeutic trials that may arise. So it's a huge expense and a huge barrier if you have a therapy that is applicable. We honestly, in the world of rare diseases, sometimes there's a therapy that's applicable to one patient in the country or 5 patients in the country. And identifying those people can be very expensive and can prevent the progression of these trials. So in the North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium database, the NAMDAC database, there are now over 1,200 patients around the country with confirmed mitochondrial disease. And at any point, we are ready to go for recruitment for clinical trials out of that database. So it's a built-in mechanism to be able to access everyone that might be eligible for a therapeutic trial.
Did you say 1,200?
Yeah, over 1,200.
It's grown
Yep.
quite a lot, hasn't it?
Yes, yeah, so it's
They're
at,
genetically confirmed. There's a
I
lot
was like
more
thinking like
patients.
12,000.
There's more patients that have suspected, but they just have not genetically.
yeah, the criteria are pretty rigorous
Yeah.
to make sure that the database has, like I said, rigorous diagnostic criteria. Yep.
So there are brain scans and there are muscle, I mean, it's really comprehensive.
Yeah.
To get in there.
And I'll let Marisa talk a little bit more about what we're doing with the cellular energetics protocol. But any questions about how our 2 research protocols that we run out of the clinic interact with one another, the cellular energetics protocol and the NAMDAC protocol?
Well, yeah, since our daughter is so rare,
Yep.
there's not a database and there's never gonna be a clinical trial for her? I mean, is that what you're kind of saying?
No. So the point that I'm making is we don't know what's going to come up, but we want to be ready when something does come up that's relevant. So we want to have the preconditions in place that are needed because those preconditions are a big barrier for rare diseases. So if we've knocked those out already, then someone who maybe they would say, yeah, there's only 10 people in the country. We wouldn't have otherwise bothered with proceeding with this therapeutic intervention. However, we know that there's a group that has done a really good natural history study, and we know that it's going to be really easy to recruit those patients. So because those preconditions are in place, why not? Let's give this a shot. Let's proceed with that.
Because I ask every time.
I know.
It's like they
Rightly so.
That's
Yeah.
why I ask every time.
And
Yeah.
some of the trials aren't based on a specific genetic
Yeah.
deviation.
Yeah.
So the stage 3 trial that's going on right now is based, they're looking at different genetic deviations.
It's not just
So-
one.
Right.
One
It just makes it so they can find you and you aren't always having to be on like
Right.
the federal
Exactly.
sites like
Exactly.
looking and looking,
Yeah.
like they can find you if they think they might have something.
So let me give you a couple examples of how this is relevant. So Heather brought up the phase 3 trial that we're currently running. So one of our other goals of our clinic is to be a site that pharmaceutical companies and other investigators around the country know to come to us for their clinical trials, because we know that we have accurately and quickly diagnosed our patients. We know that our patients have had really thorough evaluations by multiple specialists and everything that needs to be in place. And so one example of that is a drug called elamipretide, and I spoke with you all about that a year ago at this meeting. And we actually had our site initiation visit for the phase 3 trial a couple weeks ago. So we are rolling that out as we speak. So we managed to recruit about 15 patients for that trial. That trial is only open to adults. which is often the case that the initial therapeutic trials will be in adults. So for that reason, we have been working on expanding the reach of our mitochondrial clinic into more adult patients. So for those of you who know adult mitochondrial disease patients, we are happy to see them at Children's Hospital. We can't offer the same level of service for adult patients as we can for pediatric patients. So for pediatric patients, we can really provide all of the referrals within Children's Hospital that are needed. For obvious reasons, we can't refer our adult patients within Children's Hospital. So we have a little bit more of a consultative role for adult patients. So we are, Dr. Van Hove and myself are the folks here in Colorado with expertise in mitochondrial disease